have a gift for all the dads as you leave today, so make sure you stop by Connection Point out in the lobby. We have a gift for you. Also, we'll let you know, last week we told you about this little extra fundraiser we're doing for the Pregnancy Center. If you filled your baby bottle with change, I hope you brought that back today. If you didn't, just bring it by the office sometime this week. And we set an extra goal of 25 people giving $20 on the dip jar out at Connection Point. And I'm going to let you know we are really close to it. We just need 4 or 5 more people. It'll take you about 10 seconds to do that. Lindsay will be out at Connection Point. You just dip your credit card or your debit card, and that will go straight to the Pregnancy Center, a little extra help for them. Somebody asked me last week if we still accept cash, and the answer is yes. So if you have a $20 bill in your pocket that you don't know what to do with, you just give that to Lindsay, and she'll make sure it gets to the right place. So thank you for that. If you have your Bible, I want you to go to Luke chapter 8. And while you're turning there, I want to tell you about a guy who probably will not win any Father of the Year awards. So I'll show you his picture. He is married and has 2 grown children, but that's not what he's most famous for. He's most famous for being the world record holder for most escapes from prison using a helicopter. His name is Pascal Paillet. He was born July 7th, 1963 in France, and he grew up to become a notorious French gangster. By the age of 25, he was already a major player in the world of organized crime. In 1997, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. He wound up only serving 4 years of the sentence, though, because on October 12th, 2001, he escaped in what some people have called the most exciting prison escape in history. One of the things that's different in France as opposed to the United States is in France, the weight rooms and the exercise area is actually on top of the prison. The idea is if the prisoners are on top of the prison complex, they can't do much damage. And it worked like that pretty well until October 12th, 2001, when Pascal Paillet was in the weight room, which was on top of the prison, when 3 of his friends hijacked a helicopter, flew the helicopter over top of the prison, threw a rope ladder out the side of the helicopter down to Pascal Paillet, who then climbed up the ladder into the helicopter and flew away. As you can imagine, that got a lot of attention. People were amazed. They were still talking about it 2 years later in October of 2003, when this time Pascal Paillet and his buddies came and helped 3 other guys escape from the same prison in the exact same way that he had escaped 2 years earlier. By this point, the authorities were beside themselves. Not only had this guy escaped and eluded capture for 2 years, he had now helped 3 other people escape. Now, fast forward to January of 2005, and Mr. Paillet was once again captured. This time he was sentenced to an additional 30 years on top of the 30 years he already had to spend because of the murder charge. And this time around, the prison officials had this plan. They thought, here's what we'll do. We will transfer Pascal Paillet every 90 days to a different prison. So every 3 months, he went to a different prison. And while he was in prison, they kept him in solitary confinement the whole time. The idea was if he never knows where he's going to be and he can't talk to anybody, how could he possibly plan an escape? That worked fine until July 14th, 2007, when once again 4 of his friends hijacked a helicopter, landed it on top of a remote prison in eastern France, used some heavy equipment to bust through doors and cut through the steel bars and free Pascal Paillet for the second time via helicopter. So you count that up. He escaped himself twice from prison, and he helped 3 other guys escape, all using a helicopter, which makes him the world record holder, which I didn't know was a thing, but apparently it is, for 3 escapes from prison. There's actually a movie that's being made about this, and if you dig hard enough on Netflix, you can find a documentary of the greatest prison escape of all time. And what makes this so interesting, to me at least, is if you're like me, most of us go through life and we have this thought in the back of our minds that nobody ever escapes from prison. I mean, by definition, prisons are meant to be nearly impossible to escape. But then every once in a while, somebody somewhere figures out how to do it. And they remind us that while it may be difficult to escape from prison, it's not always impossible. This morning we're continuing our summer playlist series, and the song we're looking at is the song Break Every Chain. We've been looking at these songs that we sing a lot, but we don't often think about the meaning behind the songs. And this song was written back in 2009 by a guy named Will Reagan, Jamie Reagan's younger brother. No, that's not true. 2009, he lives in Knoxville, Tennessee. Since then, it's been recorded and re-recorded several times and won a Grammy in 2013. But what's interesting about this song in particular, it's one of the few songs that churches of all shapes and sizes sing. You can go to a mega church, with smoke machines and the guys, skinny jeans and a scarf, and they're singing it, or you can go to a church where they got a choir, and the choir's wearing robes, and they got a full orchestra, and they'll be singing the same song. It's one of the few songs that sort of crosses all those boundaries. And the question is, what is it about this particular song that resonates with so many people? Why is it that this song in particular is so popular? In an interview with a Nashville-based worship magazine, Will Reagan, the writer, pointed to his time serving as a short-term missionary, and there was one passage of Scripture in Luke chapter 4, really one line from Luke chapter 4, that captured his heart and prompted him to write this song. It'll be on the screen. And just to set this up for you, this all takes place at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. By this point, Jesus has already gained a reputation as a great preacher, and he goes back to his hometown of Nazareth for a visit. And while he's there, because he's gained this reputation, the local rabbi says, Jesus, since you're here on the Sabbath, why don't you just bring the message? So the hometown hero has come back to preach at his home church. And he stands up, he grabs the scroll, the Old Testament scroll, and he goes to what we know as the 61st chapter of Isaiah. It's a messianic prophecy written 700 years before the birth of Jesus. And what Isaiah is doing, he said, hey, when the Messiah shows up in the future, here's the things he'll be doing. Here's how you'll recognize him. So here's what Jesus reads. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now, that one line I want you to catch, you see it underlined there, highlighted, freedom for the prisoners. Now, as soon as the people in the synagogue heard that, their ears would have perked up, because that's what they were looking forward to. At this point in history, the Jewish people were under the authority of the Roman Empire. So even though they had some level of freedom, they were anything but free. Rome was calling all the shots. So in their minds, here they are, supposedly God's chosen people, and every decision is being made by a pagan emperor. So one of the things they were really looking forward to is when the Messiah would show up on the scene, free them from the Roman slavery, so to speak, and restore them to their rightful place on top of the food chain and as the envy of the world. So when Jesus stands up and reads Isaiah 61, and they hear that part, everybody's thinking, man, that's awesome. I can't wait for that to happen. Isn't that going to be cool? I hope that happens soon. But then Jesus adds something to it. Here's what he says in verse 20. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. And check this out. He began by saying to them, today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Now, as soon as they hear that, there's mixed reactions. But for the most part, they think, well, Jesus says, I know he's supposed to be a great preacher, but this guy's gone off the deep end. I mean, Isaiah's talking about the Messiah, and now Jesus is saying that today this scripture is fulfilled in our hearing, and they're thinking in their minds, we know this guy. I mean, we grew up with this guy. We know his family, and he might be a good preacher, but he's certainly not the Messiah. In fact, it says, if you keep reading, that some of them got so mad that they take Jesus out to the edge of town and they try to push him off a cliff. They're so upset by what he said. But this is where it gets interesting, because for the rest of Luke's gospel, from Luke chapter 4 on through the end, Luke tells us story after story that's meant to prove that what Jesus said that day was true. So you read the rest of Luke's gospel, it's one story on top of another story of Jesus proclaiming good news to the poor, giving sight to the blind, helping the oppressed, and freeing people who find themselves in prison. One of those stories that I want us to look at is in Luke chapter 8. This is a story about a guy who spent most of his life living in chains. Everybody around him knows this story. He's the type of person that if you saw him, you would probably try to get away from him as quickly as possible. We're going to read this, and you're going to think, man, this is crazy. This is so far removed from the world that you and I live in, but when you really think about it, it's not nearly as far removed as you think it is. So let me just sort of set the scene for you. Jesus and his disciples have been out traveling around. They're doing ministry, and on one particular night, they get in a boat, and they decide to sail across the Sea of Galilee. Now, you know this story. At some point in their journey, Jesus is up in the head of the boat, and he's asleep, and this storm hits. And the storm is just so ferocious that the disciples are convinced, this is it. That they're getting ready to meet their maker. They're convinced they're going to die. And then somebody goes and they wake Jesus up. And if you remember the story, Jesus stands up and he looks out at the storm. He says, hey, be still. And of all things, the storm stops. And the disciples are left there in the boat. And the Bible says they were terrified. And you would have been too. I mean, you see Jesus stop a storm. I just imagine they're spending the rest of the evening there in the boat. And they're just looking at each other. Nobody's saying anything because nobody's sure what to make of all this. And then it gets even crazier. Because they finally land, and they land in a place that's known as the region of the Gerasenes. Now, if you were to travel there today, what you find a very narrow shoreline, and it's surrounded by these limestone cliffs, and inside those cliffs are all these caves. And in the first century, they used these caves as tombs. So are all these caves filled to the brim with dead bodies, hundreds of dead bodies, and that's where they land after Jesus calms the storm. That's where they land. And then the strangest thing happens. These two guys come out to meet him. Now, Matthew tells us there was two of them. Luke only mentions one, but he's the more prominent of the two. And I want you to look at how this goes down. Remember, they've just now landed after calming the storm. Verse 26 of Luke 8. They sailed to the region of the Gerasenes, which is across the lake from Galilee. When Jesus stepped ashore, he was met by a demon-possessed man from the town. For a long time, this man had not worn clothes or lived in a house, but he lived in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell at his feet, shouting at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, don't torture me." For Jesus had commanded the impure spirit to come out of the man. Many times it had seized him, and though he was chained hand and foot and kept him under guard, he had broken his chains and had been driven by the demon into solitary places. So here's this guy, and his life has gone completely off the rails. I mean, his life is an absolute train wreck. He runs around without clothing. He's homeless, apparently has been for a long time. He lives in caves surrounded by dead bodies. The way Luke tells the story, he's isolated from everybody around him. On a few occasions, they've tried to take him into custody and chain him up, but he's so strong that he just breaks through the chains. But here's the thing you have to understand. Even though he breaks the physical chains, he's not really free. And maybe you can relate to that. For most people, the chains that we struggle against are not physical chains. You can't see them with the naked eye, but they're more powerful than physical chains could ever be. Most of the chains that we struggle against are emotional, spiritual, and psychological chains. I was at Ace Hardware a few weeks ago, and I was looking for some stuff. And have you ever went to the aisle where they sell the chains? I mean, there's all kinds of chains. There's maybe 20 different types, and some of them are really light. If you were just hanging, a hanging basket on your porch, or maybe you got a porch swing, or if you wanted to rip a tree trunk out of your grass, they got huge chains you can wrap around. But they come in all different shapes and sizes, and that's pretty much the way it works in real life too. Chains come in all sorts of different ways. For the man in Luke 8, it was the chains of demon possession that enslaved him. For some of you here today, maybe it's the chain of some addiction. Maybe it's alcohol or drugs or gambling or porn, and you keep telling yourself, I can stop whenever I want to, but deep down inside, you know that you can't. Maybe it's the chains of anxiety or depression. Some days it's not so bad, but then other days it's debilitating. Maybe the chain that holds you back is that big, heavy chain of regret. I mean, you look back over your life, and it's bad decisions and missed opportunities and fractured relations. There are a lot of people, man, they look back. They spend so much time looking in the rearview mirror at all their regrets that it's impossible for them to move forward. For a lot of you here, maybe the the chain that you wear could fall under the label of family dysfunction. You know, we celebrate Mother's Day and we celebrate Father's Day, but not everybody celebrates those days. For a lot of people, it's a reminder of a lot of unhealthy things they saw growing up, and it's caused them a lot of problems. For some people, the big issue is loneliness. Some people are just so isolated. You may not know this, but every week as we gather for worship, there are literally hundreds of people who watch us online at the very same time that we worship. And it could be that part of the reason they stay at home and watch is because they feel so isolated and disconnected. For a lot of people, it's the chains of physical suffering. Been some illness, some injury, some death in the family, and it's almost impossible to find relief. And I don't know what it is for you, but my suspicion is that you already know what it is. If you've got a chain, you know what it is. You know what it is that's holding you back and keeping you from experiencing life at its best. John 10:10, Jesus said it like this: the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. Keep that in mind, that word destroy. That's what Satan comes to do. His number one priority is to ruin your life, is to destroy your life. And if he can't get you, he'll do everything he can to get those around you. But then Jesus says, I've come that they may have life and have it to the full. Bob Russell said it like this, so true. Sin of every kind is so insidious. It begins with such a tiny, seemingly harmless thread, but woven around us in the course of time, it becomes a straitjacket that restricts and enslaves us. That's what happened to this guy in the story. He didn't start out like this. I mean, if you knew his story, he probably was a normal guy. Maybe he grew up in a normal family. Maybe he had a job, maybe he had his own family, but then at some point everything went crazy. His life went off the rails, and he found himself naked, alone, isolated out there, surrounded by dead bodies. I mean, his life just disintegrated till there was hardly anything left. But then in an unexpected moment, he's in one of those caves, and he looks out the mouth of that cave, and he looks down on the shoreline, and there's this boat that's coming to shore, and inside that boat is Jesus. And they have this encounter, and what you see in their encounter is an example of how a person breaks free. Now, one of the things I want you to notice that's so cool about this story is that rather than running away from this guy, Jesus engages this guy in a conversation. Check this out, verse 30. Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "Legion," he replied, because many demons had gone into him, and they begged Jesus repeatedly not to order them to go into the abyss. Now, it's important to understand right here from the beginning, Jesus knew this guy's name. Jesus knew this guy's situation. So when he asked him, "What's your name?" he's not asking for his legal name. He's giving him an opportunity to name his problem. And that's the first step in breaking free. If you're going to make progress, then you have to first name the issue. It's always the first step. You've heard it said the first step to solving any problem is what? It's admitting you've got a problem. If you've ever been involved in any of the 12-step programs, the very first step is admitting that you're powerless over your addiction and that your life has become unmanageable. And the reason that's the first step is because it's impossible to solve an issue until you name an issue. And for a lot of people, that's where they get stuck. A lot of people, man, they go through life and they never make progress because the idea of saying, I'm an addict, I'm depressed, I'm lonely, I'm a sinner, it just does something. It just shuts them down. The idea of showing any type of weakness and admitting it all, if they don't have all the answers, just shuts them down. But then there are other people that are convinced that they're so messed up, that they've got so many issues, that there's nothing anybody can do to help them. One of the things that's interesting about this story is that when Jesus asked this man his name, it's the demons inside of him that answered the question. And I don't know what to make of all that. Maybe that messes with your mind, and that's okay. But here's what I want you to know. He says, "My name is Legion." And in the Roman army at that time, a legion of soldiers was 6,000 soldiers. So the implication is when this guy answers Jesus' question, he's saying, "Jesus, I got a lot of issues, man. I got 6,000 issues. I got 6,000 demons that are tearing me apart." And maybe you can relate to that. Maybe you're here today and you got some issues. Maybe not 6,000, but maybe it feels like 600. Because here's what happens. Whenever you got some issue that's wrecking your life, it always leads to a lot of other issues. You got one primary issue, but that leads to lots of other secondary issues. So, for example, if you struggle with addiction, it's never just the addiction. It's the health problems, the financial problems, the relational problems. It all just adds up together. And some of you here today may be facing some things, and you got a lot of different issues, but I just got to tell you, just because you got a lot of issues doesn't mean God can't help you. I mean, the way I envision this, here the disciples, they've just seen Jesus calm the storm, and now here they are, and this guy says, hey, my name's Legion. They know what that means, 6,000 demons, and they're thinking to themselves, is it any way possible that Jesus can deal with 6,000 demons? I mean, 6,000 demons against one. But here's what you have to remember. God is never outnumbered. He's never outnumbered. Doesn't matter how many issues you got. Doesn't matter how deep the hole is you've dug for yourself. Doesn't matter what's going on. He's never outnumbered. Look at how this goes down, verse 32. A large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. The demons begged Jesus to let them go into the pigs, and he gave them permission. When the demons came out of the man, they went into the pigs, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. Again, remember, Satan's number one goal is always destruction. If he can't destroy this guy, he'll destroy the pigs. So Jesus cast the demon out, the pigs go into the herd goes in, and the problem is that was the cash crop for all the people in the community. I mean, there's pig farmers, so you got thousands of pigs that are gone, and word gets back to the pig owners what's happened. You see that in verse 34. When those tending the pigs saw what had happened, they ran off and reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. Middle of the night. When they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone out, sitting at Jesus' feet, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people how the demon-possessed man had been cured. Then all the people of the region of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them because they were overcome with fear. So he got into the boat and left. So here these folks, man, they have no idea how to respond to this. So they say, Jesus, we don't know what to make of this. All we know is that our pigs are dead, our cash crop is gone, and we want you to leave. So Jesus gets in the boat and leaves. But then check out verse 38. The man from whom the demons had gone out begged to go with him. The second step, if you want to break free, is you have to go all in following Jesus. Here's this guy. He's ready to get in the boat with Jesus. Beautiful pictures as wherever he's going, I'm going. But here's the problem. A lot of people encounter whenever they're trying to break free from some change in their life. For a lot of us, and this is what we do, we get obsessed with what we're running from and we forget what we're running towards. We get so obsessed with what we're trying to get away from that we forget to run towards something better. So a couple chapters later, Luke 11, Jesus tells a story about this guy has this demon cast out of him. While the demon's gone, Jesus says the man sweeps his house. He puts his house in order. It's just an illustration of a guy putting his life together. The problem is he never fills the vacuum that's in his heart. The demon's gone, but he doesn't fill that space with anything else. So when the demon returns, he sees that the door to this man's house is still wide open. He's never filled it up with anything better. And he brings 7 demons with him, and the guy winds up in worse shape than he was the first time. Let me give you an example how this happens in real life. I read a story not long ago about a guy named Bill Newman. He's the executive director of the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Prevention Program in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Early in his life, he was addicted to alcohol, drugs. By God's grace, he went through some rehab programs. He got clean. He stayed clean for a long period of time. The problem was somewhere in that he knew what he was running from. I mean, he knew to stay away from drugs and alcohol. He knew what he was running from, but he never ran toward anything. And pretty soon he took this job as the director of the prevention program. You know, he was convinced it was his own willpower. He's figured all this out, and now he's going to teach other people how to do it. The problem is, at the same time he took the job, he started dabbling in gambling. At first it was just, a few bucks on some games, and then it was slot machines and trips to the casino and high-stakes poker games. And that's how Satan operates. If he can't get you this direction, he has no problem, coming from this direction or going to the side door, the back door, climbing in the window. It's just what he does. And pretty soon for Bill Newman, the losses started piling up, and he didn't have any money to pay his gambling debts, so he took out loans under fake identities. He took out some credit cards under some false names. And when it all came crashing down, here's this guy, the director of the prevention program for drugs and alcohol, and he's millions of dollars in debt. He loses his job. He loses his family, loses his self-respect. And then in a moment of clarity, he joined Gamblers Anonymous and began rebuilding his life for the second time. Something Paul says in Ephesians 6, so important. He says, put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Our struggle is not against drugs and alcohol. It's not against gambling. It's not against the things that are chaining you in. Our struggle is against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly. Here's the deal. It's not enough just to break free from something. You've got to run towards something. It's not enough just to know what you're against. You have to be for something. If you really want to walk in freedom, you've got to find somebody that's stronger than you are to help you, and that's always Jesus. There's an old story about a father who was sitting in his easy chair looking out the window, and he's watching his son. His son was playing in their little sandbox in the backyard, you know. And there was this huge rock that somehow got in the sandbox, and his son was struggling to remove this rock, and he wasn't strong enough to lift it, but he could kind of push it, and he would get it against the edge of that sandbox where the little wall is, but he wasn't strong enough to lift it over. And his dad was sitting in the house looking out the window, you know, watching all this take place, and he watched for a few minutes, and finally his son just sort of gave up. He just couldn't get it, and he sat down, and he put his head down in his hands, sort of just resigned himself to the fact that the rock would be in there. And that's when his dad got up out of the easy chair, went outside, and he said to his son, what's going on? Can't you lift this rock? And the boy said, no, I can't. He said, let me ask you something, son. He said, have you used all the strength that's available to you to remove this rock from the sandbox? And the boy thought for a minute. He said, yes, sir, I have. I'm just not strong enough. And his dad said, no, son, you didn't, because you haven't asked me to help you yet. And together, the father and his son reached down in the sandbox, and they pulled out the rock. For a lot of us, the reason that we've never broken free is because we've never asked our Father to help us. We've never really gone all in our relationship with Jesus. We've been running from some things, but we haven't been running towards anything. Now check out verse 38 again. The man from whom the demons had gone out begged to go with him, but Jesus sent him away, saying, return home and tell how much God has done for you. So the man went away, and he told all over town how much Jesus had done for him. If you look at the words to the song, Break Every Chain, there's really just three lines that make up, you know, the majority of the song. First one is, there's power in the name of Jesus. The second one is to break every chain. And then you get to the third verse, and there's this little line that says, there's an army that's rising up. And the question is, well, who's in the army? And the answer is, everybody who's had their chains broken. Because here's the deal. Once you've had your chains broken, your job is to go and tell other people about your experience. So here's the third thing on your breaking free outline. It's use your scars to tell your story. Use your scars to tell your... Here's the thing about this guy. Everybody in town knew this guy's story. They knew the horror stories. Every time they looked at him, they could see, you know, I imagine there were scars on his arms and on his legs where they wrapped those chains around him. He would break through, and those chains would bite into his skin. I mean, everybody could see that. There was no hiding that. And some of you here today, you can relate to that. You may not have physical scars, but you've got emotional scars and spiritual scars. There's some deep hurts and some painful memories, and everybody around you knows your story, and it drives you crazy because you know your coworkers know, and your family knows, and your neighbors know, and you never feel like you're free. But here's the thing. Everybody knew this guy's story, and yet when they saw him, they knew there was something different about him. He was radically different. He was a changed man. That's why Jesus said, hey, it's great you want to go with me, but I got something better for you. Instead of going with me, instead of traveling with me, why don't you just stay right here and you just tell everybody that'll listen to you what I've done for you. And that's what they do. And here's the really cool part. You go to Matthew's gospel and you read a few chapters later, a few months later, Jesus and his disciples are back in the boat. They're back on the Sea of Galilee, and they land in the same spot. They go right back to the region of the Gerasenes. They land right there in that same shoreline, surrounded by all these tombs full of dead bodies, only this time, instead of a demon-possessed guy coming out and trying to scare them, there's 4,000 people waiting on them. 4,000 people. And you say, how did that happen? It happened because there was one guy who used his scars to tell his story. Now, here's my question. Where are you in all this? I don't know, but you probably know. For some of you, maybe you're still chained up. You know, I was reading on September 21st, 2007, just 2 months after escaping from prison for the second time, Pascal Payet was once again captured in Barcelona, Spain. Since then, he's been in a secret, unidentified prison. They won't even say where he's at in fear that he may try and escape a third time. But when I think about his story, it's really incredible. This guy escapes from prison twice. He helps all these other guys escape. But here's the thing. Even though he escaped from prison, he was never free. Never free. Always on the run. Always looking over his shoulder. And here's the thing: you don't have to be in a prison cell to be in prison. You know that, right? And you don't have to have physical chains wrapped around your body to be in chains. Those chains are bad, but the chains that are worse are those emotional and spiritual and psychological chains. So wherever you are in this, we want to encourage you to let Jesus break your chains. Jesus said, if you know the truth will set you free. And then in another place, he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Whoever comes to me will never die. So if you're here and you don't know Jesus, or you've never allowed him to break you free, maybe you spent your life running from some things and you've never decided what you're running towards, we want to encourage you to do that. We had a young man make that decision. First service was baptized into Christ. Some of you need to do that. I can promise you the water's warm. We got plenty of towels. We'll do whatever we need to do. Others of you may need to pray with somebody. You may want to talk with somebody. We'll help you navigate all that. If we can't help you, we'll find somebody that can. Or there may be a few of you here who've had your chains broken and you've got some scars and you know they're there and the people around you know you're there, but you never talk about them. You say, I don't want to talk about it. But it could be that God could use your scars to tell your story to help other people get their freedom. So whatever it is you need to do, I want you to stand. And we're going to sing this song as a prayer. And if you've never experienced what this song is talking about, or you just want to be a part of a church that wants to help other people break free, we want you to come and meet us on this front row.